I studied engineering at university. When I was at school, the way that I was taught science was you are learning sets of facts, and those facts are fundamental truths about the universe.
Hmm.
Well, that's not actually how science works in real life. It was only really as a journalist when I when I saw how scientists actually work that you very quickly start to realize that, of course, scientists are people just like the rest of us. They live in the world like the rest of us, and the questions they ask, and sometimes even the answers they give, the theories they come up with, are completely influenced by the world around them and their worldview.
What do you think that that the reason why this is such a there's such a resurgence now? It just occurred to me because what you said about science, yeah, everybody should be aware of this, but I feel that the the embracing of data science and the ability to do that in the digital realm, to amass this data, has brought forth a kind of a group of scientists, some of them well-meaning, some of them with nefarious goals, and they some of them are aware, but I think some of them are really not aware. They're under this delusion of the objectivity that this data does not lie. And sort of the convergence of us now living in a world where it's easy and efficient to amass this data, coupled with a group of people. I'm not going to name any names, but they have this religious belief in this data, that solves all these problems. Is that maybe the main reason why it's so broadly accepted now again, these kind of theories?
But I do think there's an aspect of that that, we place a faith in science and technology that beyond what science and technology can actually deliver. That we, they become almost like gods to us. Um, and to some degree, I still have a lot of faith in science. We wouldn't have got through this pandemic if it hadn't been for those brilliant people who developed vaccines, for instance.
Well, I'm not
But
advocating
um,
not having trust in science. I mean, I think the other issue here is really that now it's easy for those nefarious forces to bring doubt into absolutely everything. Say, well, you can't, everything is relative. I mean, that's also not a new phenomenon. It's just amplified. But I think that the what I mean is that this specific brand of data scientists and the folks who are sort of the fanboys and girls of these people, and many of them in the media. And it's very convenient to just throw up a statistic and go like, here you go, that's what it is. Yeah.
we have this faith in data to be able to explain the world. I've heard data scientists explain it this way, that if we just had enough information, if we could
Yeah.
collect enough information on every single person, that we would magically understand everything. There was even a book written a number of years ago arguing that it would be the end of science once we have enough data, that would be the end of science.
Oh
Well,
God.
that's not how the world works. It's really
Yeah.
not. Data in itself does not explain things. It can describe them maybe up to a point. It can explain things, and it can't, you know, not have we would not have the beautiful scientific theories that we have just through data. Um, we certainly can't understand human difference just through data. We are a moving target as a species. We are inherently cultural and social as a species. We're always moving and always changing because we are intrinsically cultural and social. So to measure who we are is nigh on impossible. I would argue that it's a fool's errand to try and fully describe who the human species is, or to try and pin down some kind of fundamental human nature, because how we live is as much defined by culture as it is by anything else.
And Shyla here in the chat says, I've heard AI is also influenced in this way. Do you see a way to remove such bias from such systems? Maybe we'll bring that up later, but Shyla brings up a good point. This is also, there is obviously a lot of discussion in the realm of, for example, predictive policing, which also plays into that, the kind of the faith in having the data and then applying this to to see who is more prone to crime and the predictability of crime, essentially, which yeah, is related to this topic very much, I would say. I want to move the subject to Mankind Quarterly, a fine website. I don't know if they have if they have a print magazine, but this is really totally bonkers. And you interviewed the guy, I think is a German guy. Now the name is Meisenberg is his name. And he runs that website or whatever his role is. But this is a website that, and I browsed this website today, and it's really fascinating. They have coded language here. For example, this is an article, Stability of Italian Regional Intelligent Differences for 150 Years. Now, my understanding is that this organization is their goal is to again prove that there is a genetic disposition for regional differences in intelligence and achievement, and that also applies to entire nation states vis-a-vis their neighbors. I don't know, Bulgaria versus Germany or whatever it is. But here, for example, stability of Italian regional intelligence differences for 150 years. Well, that sounds like okay, interesting. And then you go down here a little bit. Um, and yeah, it becomes clear that people in the south of Italy are less intelligent. The reason for that being is probably a genetic one, and not that that region has been starved of resources, etc. Here is a more obvious one: the rhetoric and reality of police shootings and the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm throwing this up on the big slide board here. This is pretty offensive. They write here in this abstract that let me bring up this here because I underlined it. Blacks are undeniably shot at more than twice their expected number based on their proportion of the US population. Okay. But this is explained by the fact that black suspects place themselves in situations in which officers are justified in using lethal force. I had the production meeting with Shyla earlier, and Shyla was like, "What? They placed themselves in front of the cops' gun, and so well, it's your own fault." I mean, this is really absolutely absurd. And then they keep going that anyways, they bring this back to the Black Lives Matter rhetoric. Exactly. Panny in the local chat says blame the victim. That's the strategy here. But talk a little bit about this Mankind Quarterly. Uh, we would, it's maybe easy to dismiss, for me to dismiss this as a marginal group. Are they that marginal? What? Tell us a little more about what you found out about them.
So I started, the Mankind Quarterly has been well known, notorious in academic circles since the 1960s when the first edition came out. The reason it was first published was that in the middle of the 20th century, especially after what happened in the Second World War, there was a move away from scientific racism. So race moved out of biology and into the social sciences as the study of racism and discrimination, which is where the study of race belongs. But there were a number of academics, mainly fringe characters, but not entirely, who wanted to keep that old-fashioned notion of race alive, that 19th century belief that biologically real and that there were meaningful differences. They also believed in segregation. They believed that racial mixing was dangerous to a population. And so they founded their own journal, and that is the Mankind Quarterly. When it first came out in the 1960s, it was reviewed in some big scientific journals. I mean, as much as a journal could be panned, there were so many critiques of the content. The content was just terrible, scientifically, morally, ethically. There were typographical errors. It was just bad on every level. And there were calls for it to be shut down. The reason it wasn't shut down was that it was independently funded by a very wealthy American heir, a segregationist called Wycliffe Draper. Um, and he bankrolled not just the magazine itself, but also many of the contributors for decades. Even after his death, the funds that he did are still funding people now.
Hmm.
So I've just been investigating again. I've been doing a follow up since I I wrote in 2018. I've just been doing a follow up this year, and just this year, who was fired, a professor in the US, was fired from his university for misusing NIH data, was given a was given a grant by the Pioneer Fund, which is this fund that Wycliffe Draper set up, and that story will be in Undark magazine on Friday. Look out for it on
Ah,
Friday. And
Monkey,
what you
can
can
you find
see is
that
that
link for the magazine? That'd be great. Sorry to jump in here. Go ahead.
Undark. So there is this nexus between these fringe characters who are undoubtedly fringe. You know, they are not widely cited, they are not mainstream or academia anymore, but they are incredibly influential on the far right. And in
Mm,
fact, if you look at the manifesto that was written by the who killed 10 black people at a supermarket in Buffalo earlier this
Buffalo.
year. You
Yep.
might remember that case. It was a terrible, terrible story. There are a lot of mass shootings in the US, but this one in particular, the shooter left a manifesto citing lots of scientific papers, many of those papers written by people who contributed to the Mankind Quarterly.
So this is really important, folks, to understand that these are not fringe phenomena or fringe publishers. This is there is money behind this. In the case here with the foundation, they can produce media. That media reverberates into other media, and yeah, and young people who are seeking answers why. They are disadvantaged in this society. They look to Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson tells them to clean their room. They clean their room, and they still don't have opportunities in the job market. And it's not that funny, but it's a slippery slope that is aided nonstop by a nonstop barrage on all media channels, and that makes it very dangerous. But talk a little bit about the fact that these people, you were saying one professor was fired, so the the scientists are in institutions, but there's also politicians, there is political advisors that advise these politicians around the world, or
Yep.
is it most prominent in America, you would say?
Most prominent in America. It's a global network of people. If you look at the contributors to the Mankind Quarterly and the advisory board, there are people all over the world.
No, I
This
meant
is
how it extends into politics. I mean, this is interesting because in Germany,
right.
feels to me it is fueled by a guy here who wrote something similar to the Bell Curve, which is a book from the mid 90s, which also just perpetuates this. There's a guy here in Germany, Thilo Sarrazin, who wrote that the migration from different countries into Germany is basically diluting the intelligence of the precious German children, and that is bad for the well, for our progress and our GDP essentially. And that book sold 3-4 million copies back in 2010. Um, and politicians are not immune to those ideas floating around in the public mind. So I was wondering if you feel that now that you're also in America, if in America that is maybe more prevalent among politicians and their advisors.
There is, I mean, it's very rarely as explicit as you just described. Often anti immigration rhetoric is couched in this kind of otherness. They are different from us. It's when Trump was in power, he would often describe immigrants from America or Central America, Mexico, from Middle East or Africa as being not as good quality as immigrants from Europe, or
Mhm.
especially from Western Europe. So there is this. There's this undertone uh, of which doesn't sound like 19th century race science, but absolutely borrows entirely from that playbook, that uses that same um, view, that idea that races exist and there are fundamental behaviors and psychological differences between these racial groups that mean that a multicultural society isn't possible, that we can't coexist as there are profound cultural differences that can't even be overcome over generations because we are fundamentally different.
Mm.
And you don't just see that in the US, you see it everywhere. I was living in Berlin over the summer, I was doing a fellowship there, and it is still prevalent there, despite the fact that in Germany, huge moral reckoning, and people have tried so hard to have that conversation around race and what it really means. That still exists in certain corners. In the UK, it still exists. In France, I mean, it's so popular. This belief in the Great Replacement theory is so
Great
popular in
replacement
places like
theory. Yeah.
France.
Hmm.
Mm,
Sorry, you were
This is
breaking up. I
a
was just. Oops. Go ahead. We have a little delay. I apologize, stepping on you there. Go ahead.
I was just saying that these are prevalent ideas, and they may not appear to be, racist on the surface, but they borrow from the same ideology that got us to where we are now, that feed this anti-immigration, nationalist, populist, far-right agenda in many countries around the world.
And I'm posting this here to give context with the guy I just mentioned, Thilo Sarrazin, who was a politician. My point earlier was not that the politicians are explicit, but that politicians are reacting obviously to the temperature in the culture, and then some of them, denounce it and position themselves against it. But more often than not, a lot of politicians opportunistically use it. This guy Thilo Sarrazin, a former social democrat, actually, he was reprimanded. I didn't even know this. I'm just looking this up by the UN over his remarks about Muslim immigrants back around 2010. And it's just, but he couches these ideas in respectable words, and I sometimes call it the wine track of racism versus the beer track. I don't know if that's classist. It could be. I drink neither beer nor wine. uh, what I mean is that Sarrazin appears with a suit and a tie, and his ideas are as despicable as the ideas of the guy who's beating up immigrants on the street. um, but they're for a different class of people. Now, speaking about Germany, Angela, let's talk about the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. I'm in Munich, Germany. Munich, Germany is very dominated by the Max Planck Society. Now, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was here's a few pictures here. This is the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physik, for physics. Here's the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for chemistry. Kaiser Wilhelm was the last ruler in Germany before Germany in 1918 became uh, briefly a republic. Before then, it descended into chaos again. But he founded, under his name, was founded this research institute. Very, very important. Here's the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity. And here you can see the swastika flag in the corner. So this is already when the Nazis took power. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute then became the Max Planck Institute when the Nobel laureate Max Planck becomes the president. And that was in 1930. And today, the Max Planck Institute researches on a whole variety of topics, does very, very important work. And you write in your book that in the 90s, the executive over there wanted to look into the past a little bit and found some pretty bad things. Talk a little bit about that.
Remember that what happened in Nazi Germany was not something that only involved those in power at the top, of course. It also involved scientists and intellectuals and academics. Um, and institutions like the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, which are now known as the Max Planck Institute, were, of course, as some of the major scientific organizations of Germany, involved in all of that. It takes time, I think, for institutions to reckon with their historic legacies. I see that even now, that many institutions are very nervous about breaking up their past for fear of what that might do to their reputations, what people might think. But in Germany's case, in the case of the Max Planck Institutes, that was particularly true because some of those people were still alive, obviously, after the war. They were still working. And
What
it was
did
only
they
really
do? I
after
mean,
they
we
had
know.
died.
Give us a few examples. What happened during the heyday of eugenics in Germany?
Well, there was experimentation that went on victims of the Holocaust, the body parts of victims of the Holocaust. Um, there was there was a machinery involved. You know, the creation of this horrible, devastating industrial complex in order to kill people involved engineers. It involved scientists. It had to have done because it couldn't have been built otherwise. And also, there was an ideological underpinning to all of that, and there were scientists involved in shoring up these ideas of eugenics and race science, promoting them, supporting the politicians who wanted them. And the Max Planck in the 1990s had a kind of historical analysis of who among its staff had been involved, and they had been involved, of course. That there were people involved in all of that, and they apologized. And it's one of many, many kind of such reckonings that I think need to happen
Hmm.
right across the world, probably.
Hmm.
In
Absolutely.
these, it isn't just in Germany, but in many parts of the world, that kind of reckoning is happening. And certainly here in the US, there have been universities who have now been looking at their eugenic histories because there were sterilizations in the US. There were eugenic style policies that meant that women were sterilized. There were links, of course, to slavery and colonialism. And it's only really in the last few years that institutions have been doing that kind of hard work. And it's not easy. I can tell you it's very painful for them. And sometimes it can be very painful for their older donors and supporters.
And it's a good thing. And I browsed their website, and they really break it down, and that has to be commended. Also, the transparency is
Mm.
good. The apologies are very good. Just because you mentioned apologies, I want to throw this one up because there was no apology. Well, there might have been an apology, but certainly no reparations. This is a picture from 1906, the Herero and Nama a genocide that was perpetrated by the German colonizers back in the early 20th century under Lothar von Trotha, the greatest general. You know, slaughtered slaughtered the native folks over there, and there's been negotiations going back and forth about this. Um, and very reasonable demands for reparations in that case, and absolutely